Well, thank you for coming, everyone. I've always appreciated the support and lots of people being willing to come along and join me on these, what really are flights of fancy, because that's what these talks are. So 8 years ago I had an idea for a talk, and basically I wanted that talk to be about the two areas in which I actually hold qualifications, as opposed to, you know, all those sermons I give, which are based on very little. So I actually want to talk about the things I'm qualified in, which is psychology and religious study. And then, as I was explaining the other day, I shared this with Rod, and I said, I've got this idea for this sort of series of talks, and then he got talking and he said, oh, but what about this, and what about that? And it just turned into something else entirely. And that was 8 years ago, and so we had a nice series of talks which were great, and there you go, they're still on YouTube. You can go and watch those back if you ever want to. A much younger version of me. So they're still there. And then I did another one, and then I did that zombie thing, and did a thing on Jesus the Revolutionary, and then last year I talked about Israel, and I never actually got around to talking about that original talk. So, you know, in planning these last few months that I've been here, I just need to tick that off. I want to go back and talk about that stuff again, partly because also this is what I want to go back to doing again. So it's a little bit of a looking behind, but also looking ahead. So that's where the idea came from. So anyway, but it's also a way of dealing with stuff that just doesn't fit into Sunday sermons. 10 minutes for a sermon, well, 20 minutes if you're Liam. It was for an assignment, it's okay. You needed to give 20 minutes last week. So anyway, 20 minutes from Liam. But, you know, really 10 to 15 minutes, and some topics just don't fit in around lectionary reading. So this is an opportunity to talk about some other fun stuff. So, psychology and religion. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about psychology and some of the things that psychology has to say about religion. It's by no means an exhaustive account, and trust me, I'm not an expert, but I'm someone who's dipped a toe in, and this is kind of an area that I'm interested in. So, and I'm here to share some things that I found interesting, so if I find them interesting, hopefully you might find them interesting too. At least more interesting than the zombie talk I gave. So one of the tricks that first-year psychology papers across universities around the world do is that they pull out all the best bits from the entire field of psychology, and that's what they present first. So first-year students, they dip their toe in and they get hooked. That's the idea. So I'm going to follow that pattern a little bit this evening and share some of the sort of classic stories from the world of psychology. So some of you may have heard some of these things before, or be familiar with them, but I will always be bringing them back to what do these sort of important major studies have to say about religion. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So, where to start? Well, the first person I should mention, of course, is the founder of modern psychology. Would anyone like to hazard a guess who I am speaking about? Excellent. It's not Sigmund Freud. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, Wilhelm Wundt is the person who is really seen as being of critical importance to the formation of psychology as a science in its own right. And the reason he's given this title of sort of founder is because he established the world's first experimental psychology laboratory. So it was very much that experimental approach which modern psychologists really uphold as being the decisive step in opening up this field of psychology. He did that in Leipzig in Germany in 1879, so the first kind of part of a university dedicated to experimental psychology. Now at the School of Psychology I attended, it was made very clear that Wundt was the founder of modern psychology, and any mention of that Austrian psychoanalyst you just happened to talk about would not be beneficial to your academic success. Made very clear. I actually learned surprisingly little about Wundt and his work, but the status of founder was very important, so that was the first key point. And and as I say, that's the key thing. He was the first to really apply quite the sort of hard scientific method to the study of human psychology. But of course the person you mention is the one most people think of. And I am going to talk a bit about him. Now, when I was doing my degree in psychology, I had probably less than 4 hours of lectures on Sigmund Freud. One of those lectures, a highly memorable one in third year, the lecturer began by saying, "Freud was a charlatan, and in the next 60 minutes I'm going to prove it." And off she went. All right, so that was very much the take in the School of Psychology. It was only when I was doing postgraduate work in religious studies that I really got to wrestle with Freud and deal particularly with his views around religion, because he was very opinionated when it came to religion. So I'm going to say a little bit more about him now. But before I get too deep into that topic, I do just want to address the fact that Freud is something of a polarising figure. He never actually said "your mum." Sorry, this is a joke. I have a t-shirt with this on, which I'm often discouraged from wearing publicly, but I do like it, so there you go. It's making light of certain Freudian ideas. All right? And anyway, I'm going to say a couple of things about Freud, but I do just want to say I'm not a Freudian apologist. Now, I certainly wouldn't go as far as that lecturer of mine who says, who said he was a charlatan. I accept that many of his ideas, while interesting, and where I would agree with it, they did have little scientific validity, meaning that actually lots of the ideas and thoughts that he came up with and shared, which a lot of people take as gospel in the sort of Freudian school of psychology, not a lot of evidence for, okay, and not a lot of scientific support, and so we do need to bear that in mind. That said, where I would defend him a little bit is that his work was prolific. He wrote huge amounts. He had many, many ideas. He changed his mind over the course of his lifetime on many things, and I think that particular lecture I had talked about that as being a bad thing, the fact that he changed his mind. I would very much say the opposite. The ability to review, admit where you've got mistakes and sharpen up your ideas is actually a very, very positive academic trait, and he certainly did that. But the key thing where I think we have to give him his due is that he was a very courageous person. In a time and in a culture that was quite repressed, he opened up all sorts of topics. And ultimately, he changed Western thinking. And there are all sorts of things which we talk about today which are part of Freudian thought, and we don't recognise that part of Freudian thought. All right? There's a little thing like, often we talk about being defensive. Well, the first person to describe defence mechanisms, Sigmund Freud. So that's something we take for granted, but we don't necessarily attribute to him. Just a small example. Just a slightly different take on this. Slightly different take. So I've recently become aware of this really interesting phenomena that concerns this 90s sitcom. Hopefully you at least have a passing awareness that this was this TV comedy in the 90s, early 2000s that was very, very popular. Now, for my generation in the 90s, this program was the definition of must-see TV. It was considered funny, a little bit risky, and somewhat progressive in its own way, certainly progressive in its own time. And it was hugely successful, as I've already said, very popular, and ran for 236 episodes. And by the end, this core cast, they were all earning millions of dollars every episode. It was a real juggernaut of a TV show. Now, in recent times, this series has become available on Netflix and other sort of streaming services, and is being watched for the first time by a whole new generation. This new generation are not convinced that Friends is this comedic masterpiece. In fact, many have suggested that there are some very big problems with the program, okay? It relies on a whole lot of gender stereotypes, which is another way of saying it's quite sexist. Certainly by today's measure, it's quite sexist in places. Some of the characters are overtly homophobic, and at times there's even some subtle racism. There's not a lot of diversity happening with the core cast there, is there? All right? Now, comedy of one generation often doesn't sit well with younger generations. Comedy is one of those things that really, the patterns of society change so fast that what was funny in one era can very rapidly change and not be considered appropriate only a few years later. What I think the younger generation who are watching Friends for the first time don't quite understand is that over those 236 episodes, the characters do change. They grow, they learn, their attitudes shift. So where they are at the beginning of the series, when it first began, is actually quite different. And as I say, it's a series that ran for over 10 years. And by the end, they're in a very different place, all of them. They've all sort of learned, grown and changed. And I think we need to take that into account. And they do. All the characters mature into people who are not homophobic. That's one small example. They actually... one of the key storylines in Friends, which really made it make its mark on popular culture, was the fact that one of the characters was recently divorced, and the reason he was divorced was because his partner had come out and begun a same-gender relationship. And he had to wrestle with that and deal with it. So some of the early homophobia is actually about his wrestling with this change of status. Now, that doesn't seem like a really earth-shattering storyline for us these days, but it was not so long ago where this was one of the first portrayals in mainstream TV of that sort of storyline. So there we go. In its time, it was quite groundbreaking. So anyway, what my broader point is here is that when it comes to Freud, we shouldn't necessarily ignore the problematic parts of his work, but we do need to consider the time and the context in which he was working. Of course, some of the stuff he said just doesn't measure up over time, but he was doing his major work over a century ago. In 1907, Freud made his first contribution to the study of religion in a paper titled Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices. Now, it's highly likely that Freud's childhood experience had some bearing on this first critique he made of religion, because Freud himself was Jewish, but he was raised in a very heavily Roman Catholic environment, and in fact, as a child, he was taken to Mass. Now, of course, at the time he lived, he experienced a great amount of anti-Semitism, and of course, a lot of that anti-Semitism came out of this Roman Catholic environment in which he grew up. So the key observation in this particular paper was that many religious rituals are kind of obsessive-compulsive in the way that they're carried out. And just sort of think about that from various religious actions, and think about there's various ritual that we perform here week after week in various ways, and at times we can be quite fussy about the way in which we do things, and things happen in a particular order, in a particular way. And trust me, as the person up front, if you make a mistake, people do suddenly come, oh, that one, you get what I'm talking about. And he made the claim, as I say, talking very much about these precise actions, but also he focused very much on the way that, people could feel very guilty if the actions weren't carried out properly. If there was a mistake and something didn't happen, suddenly people feel really, oh no, I messed up in church and this didn't, And so he drew on these ideas and he says, well, that's it. Religion is an obsessional neurosis. That's how he characterised all religion. Very broad sweeping statement. He's good on the grand gesture. Did he have a point? Well, at a certain level, I think he does. I think he does make a good point. Sometimes religious practice can become obsessive, particularly about the way things should be done, and sometimes we become so obsessed with the way of doing things that we lose sight of why we are doing things. So sometimes the action becomes more important than the reason for the action. I know as someone who was raised as an Anglo-Catholic, and I would still cast myself in that mould really, that I've had to work hard to relax some of my beliefs about the way I approach church. Some habits, though, do die hard. A small example. Well, you might guess where I'm going. Only 1 week ago, last Sunday, I spilled a small amount of communion wine. Right, at the Eucharist, spilled some communion wine. Now, intellectually, I can rationalise that away and believe that God is not about to punish me for this. I don't have to feel terrible or guilty or all of those things. But deep down, my gut reaction was quite different to what the head says. And there's still that real anxiety. So I did have some quite intense feelings, even if I managed to deal with them fairly quickly. And my instant reaction was to self-reprimand. Some of you may have said, in fact, even heard me say, the second it happened, I think I said, "Grunt." I'm pretty sure it went out over the microphone when you heard it. So, but it was just that instinctual reaction. Oh, I've spilled communion wine. This is the blood of Christ. There's something still in my belief system that feels anxious about that. Now, where I think Freud is wrong in terms of his characterisation of religion as obsessional neurosis is more to do with what he implies. Freud took a negative view of religion and ultimately felt it prevented people from fulfilling their potential. This is made clearer in a later piece of writing of his called The Future of an Illusion, in which Freud claimed that religion is a belief system typically based upon falsehood and has no true value. So the conclusion of The Future of an Illusion, well, there's no future, it's only an illusion. And the illusion, of course, is religion. So that's what he's suggesting there. His views, however, were very Western-centric and ultimately failed to account for the good works of religious people. If Freud was right and religion is simply a dysfunctional attempt to relieve psychological stress, he failed to explain manifestations of generosity, kindness, self-sacrifice. You get the idea. Essentially, Freud didn't address the problem, for him, of altruism. And altruism, of course, is a very major aspect of most systems of religious belief. The idea of giving willingly of ourselves for little or nothing in return. And Freud just can't quite reconcile it. Well, he just doesn't talk about it. That's the other. He just ignores it, pretend it's not there. Now, there's lots more I could say about Freud. He was a very colourful character. And I do think it's good for religious people to take seriously his critiques and to think about them. But there are some other people to talk about. This is the next one. William James. William James was a professor of psychology and philosophy. He was also extremely interested in the topic of religion and was really the first psychologist to engage positively with aspects of religious behaviour. In 1901 and 1902, James gave a number of lectures on the topic of religion that have been reproduced as a book titled The Varieties of Religious Experience. So some of you know that of that book. Actually, when one of Emily's grandfathers died a few years ago, and we divvied up his books, I found a very nice copy that he had in his possession, which I have very happily in my bookcase now. So it's a book that's still in print, and it's still picked up and loved, actually, by lots of people. Now, unlike Freud, James believed that religious experiences were deeply human in origin and typically positive in outcome. He was quick to point out that science should not be so quick to dismiss unseen or unknown phenomena, choosing instead to remain open to the possibility of there being more to the universe than what we have already come to understand. For example, it was William James who said, "We know the meaning of consciousness so long as no one asks us to define it." We know the meaning of consciousness so long as no one asks us to define it. We certainly believe in this idea of consciousness, but it is something, decades after he said that still eludes firm definition. Now again, I'm not going to take too much of a deep dive into William James. My key point is that he was important in that he believed religion to be a topic worthy of deep investigation, and that science is an important tool in doing that work. So it's quite an important foundation of people. So, to some actual discoveries from the world of psychology about religion. Well, the first thing I'm going to share about comes sort of broadly under this heading, because this is where the field of investigation began. What is good religion and what is bad religion? It's a bit of a blunt question, but you'll hear how some people dealt with it. So there was an important study conducted in 1697 by Allport and Ross, which suggested that while one cannot define good religion from bad, there are certainly different types of religious motivation, the reason why people become religious. They developed what is called the religious orientation scale. At one end of the scale is a religious orientation that they basically describe as self-serving. At that end of the spectrum are people who are religious because it gives them status or rewards them in some particular way. At the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are attracted to a religion because of the values of that religion. So people at that end of the spectrum tend to be more altruistic, whereas for others, religion is simply a means to an end. And they came up with this as an idea of a spectrum with different people existing at different points of the scale. So for example, you might have two people like this on either end of the scale. You can work out where you would place each, but at one end I'd suggest we have Gandhi. Gandhi, who says things like, happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. And at the other end of the spectrum, making no judgment at all, we have a certain president saying, first of all, I am a great Christian, and I am. Remember that. One end, altruism, one end, possibly self-serving. I'll let you make the judgment about which is which. Okay, I accept that choosing these two people was a bit like shooting fish in a barrel. But when I found the quote on the right, I couldn't resist. Now, like all things in science, this particular scale, this idea of religious orientation and being on a spectrum, has been critiqued and analysed and tested and retested, because that's the scientific method. Keep testing it, see if you can refine it, see if you can improve it. Now, one scholar felt that the scale didn't adequately measure what he described as mature religion. While he agreed that the spectrum certainly measured immature, that is, self-serving religion well, he didn't agree with the other end of the scale and the way that they sort of discussed the idea of religious maturity. And he said, that doesn't ring true for me. I've got some other values that I want to apply to that. This scholar, his name's Batson, felt that mature religion was not characterised by certainty or orthodoxy or any of those sorts of terms. Rather, he believed mature religion was expressed through openness, tentative questioning, flexibility, and exploration. So those are the values he held. And he summed up this fresh definition of mature religion with a single word. And that word is quest. So he conceived of religion as being healthy, mature religion, like being on a quest, which is a journey of discovery. A journey where we're open to new experiences, and we might think differently about things from one day to the next. I'll be honest and say I like this measure of religion, largely because it describes my kind of religion. And that's what drew me to this initially. My experience of being a professional religious person is that over time I have become less sure about many things, but have grown to be happy and at ease with the uncertain. That's not a journey towards orthodoxy, it's a journey towards openness. And that's really what this idea of quest is about. Now, it has been argued that maybe this is really a measure of agnosticism. Now, the proponents of this measure, Batson and others, responded to that particular sort of accusation or critique of the idea of quest by, well, basically he evaluated a number of seminarians, students training for ministry. And sure enough, they did find that people in seminary, in that environment of learning and preparing for ministry, do score higher on the quest scale than people in the general public. Of course, in that, they're not trying to suggest that the seminarians are agnostic. Maybe they are, but that's probably a debate for another time. Another major finding concerns Christians and prejudice. A major finding in the 1970s concerned Christian attitudes towards people of different ethnic backgrounds. Essentially, the question being posed was, are Christians less racist than non-Christians? Who here thinks that Christians are typically less racist than non-Christians? Anyone brave enough?
Some people on both ends.
Depends.
Depends. See, you're so Anglican. Oh, $1 each way, somewhere in the middle.
Well, no, I don't
Okay.
answer that.
Well, for those of you who do think, I'm sorry, but those people are wrong. You've ruined my joke, you see. You needed to be committed to, yes, of course Christians are less racist than non-Christians, but they're not. And that's the finding, at least on the face of it. So heaps of studies in the 70s were conducted around this question. Different religious groups, different places, different demographics. It kept coming back the same, over and over again. Christians demonstrated higher levels of prejudice than non-Christians. Now, however, one follow-up study was very clever and thought about this some more and adopted a slightly different approach. Rather than looking at Christians as a whole, this study asked a slight refinement of the question, not just are you Christian or not, and then measuring other attitudes, but it also asked them, the people responding in the study, about how often they went to church, and to see if there were any effects around whether church attendance made any difference to this finding about racism. Now, the thinking was, essentially, a lot of the Christian tradition supports care of those outside of the immediate group. Let's face it, the Old Testament frequently speaks about the plight of the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. It's a constant repetition, actually, throughout the Old Testament. The New Testament commandment, of course, love your neighbour. So there are these things in Christianity which would suggest, surely, Christians get pulled in a more open attitude towards people of different ethnicities. So as I say, they were clever. They thought about the study and went, let's look at church attendance. Let's see if this shifts the scale at all. And here's what happens. So here's my graph, and what we have down the bottom are different. Well, the first group we have is the non-Christian group, and this is the level of, on this measure of racism that comes up. So then the next group they look at are people who don't come to church very often, once a month at the most. And they look at their scale and go, okay, they are more racist than the non-Christians, but not significantly so. Yes, there's a measurable effect here, but actually overall, because the scale goes up a long way, they're still fairly close. Slightly more racist than people who never come to church, but not a lot more racist. Then they look at these people who come 2 to 3 times a month. And these people are quite racist. But then we come to the final group, and these are people who are in church every week or even more than every Sunday, because of course lots of church communities don't just meet weekly. Even in this church community we have services during the week. How did they score? Well, they're the least racist group of all. So a really interesting finding. As I say, there's a lesson here. And really the lesson is to do with the view of this particular scholar, very much in his write-up of this, essentially said it is to do with the transformational exercise of religion. If you're only halfway in, you're probably able to keep whatever attitude you have before you become religious intact. Meaning, if you have a view of I'm white, therefore I'm superior to non-whites, I'm only just in and out. I'm probably not getting challenged about that viewpoint particularly. Whereas if I'm turning up every week, eventually those different messages are going to have an impact on me and probably shift my attitude. But similarly, those who hardly come at all, well, they're typically, as I say, they're just similar to the people who never come at all. So there you go. More vicars need to know about this. I think it's good encouragement for weekly attenders. Well, it is. There you go. It's there. Science says come every week, everyone, or not at all. Maybe not the not at all. Come every, but no, they are the least racist. So less racism than the general public. Now, just a quick aside. The reason I know about this study in particular was because when I was doing my honours thesis many years ago, I was building on this particular piece of work, looking at discrimination, and the discrimination I was looking at was between people of different Christian denominations about prejudice between each other. So what that idea is, perhaps there are some people who are less than ecumenical and have this idea of, because I'm an Anglican, of course, Anglicans are the best form of Christianity. It's that sort of idea of saying, does that exist? It's an idea that my denomination is superior to others. Now, my actual study didn't find it. At least in the congregations that I looked at. But no, that actually most were sort of like, well, yes, we've got different emphases, but a Christian's a Christian was largely the attitude. And this was in Wellington 15 years ago. Now that doesn't mean that this idea doesn't exist, it's very hard to often find those communities where this idea is present and to then get them to also fill out forms that are going to suggest that yes, they do think they're better than other Christian denominations. But there you go. But yes, but the nice thing was we found actually on a whole lot of measures of Christianity there's far more in common between mainline Christian denominations than there is what actually separates them. So that was actually ultimately a vote in favour of ecumenism. So I've been speaking about some studies that looked explicitly at religion, but now I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of these sort of the great big studies, the really well-known psychological findings, and how they might suggest something about religion. So the next study I'm going to talk about begins with this man. I appreciate the groan. Kind of timely, actually. We've had, as I say, we've had a bit of focus on the war, particularly with Remembrance Sunday last weekend, remembering the First World War particularly, but Rod picked up on that today and talked more about World War II. So, of course, Hitler, and of course, you can't talk about Hitler without some acknowledgement of this particular event in the 20th century, which is known as the final solution. And this is actually the letter where that expression was taken from. The full phrase was the final solution to the Jewish question, and it was a paper prepared by Reinhard Heydrich, and was essentially, this is the plan that leads to the Holocaust, essentially. Now, more specifically, one of the people involved in this is this man, and his name is Adolf Eichmann, and he was an officer, a German officer in World War II, and he had a particular job, and his job was he was essentially in charge of transportation, and his job was to coordinate in a systematic way moving initially Jewish people into ghettos and then from ghettos into concentration camps. So he was certainly not a frontline soldier in that sense, but it was all about those logistics. And he was very, very good at that job. He found all sorts of efficiencies that move people to their deaths more rapidly, and that's just the reality of what he did. Now, at the end of the war, Eichmann was one of the Nazis, like many others who escaped US custody and fled and ended up in Argentina, as many others did. And he actually lived there for 10 years after the war. On May 11th, 1960, members of Mossad, and of course we know Mossad being the Israeli Secret Service, captured Eichmann. They had asked for his extradition, but Argentina had said no, leave him alone. So they essentially kidnapped him and returned him to Israel to stand trial. And so in 1961, Eichmann went on trial on 15 charges, including the charge of crimes against humanity. Now, Eichmann's only defence was a very simple one, and it was, I was simply following orders. That was his defence. The defence, of course, failed. He was convicted on all of those 15 charges, and he was executed at the beginning, halfway through 1962. What do you think about that defence? I was just following orders. Is it possible that he was just following orders? Well, in the States, there was this man, and his name is Stanley Milgram, and he was a psychologist living in America at the time of the Eichmann trial, and he watched the trial because it was broadcast, and Milgram was really, the Eichmann's defence made a real impression on him, essentially. And he admits that he really watched this trial out of a sort of morbid fascination. You know, was Eichmann going to be this terrible monster that kind of Nazi, officers had become in the public conscience? Because that's what he was expecting. And instead there was this very quiet, softly spoken, humble man who simply has this very simple defence. And so Milgram was very struck by this and went, we haven't got this. This isn't what I expected a mass murdering monster to be. What if we take his defence seriously? Is there a way I can examine that to find out scientifically whether there's any merit to what he said? And so this is probably the most famous experiment in psychology ever. The 1960s was kind of the Wild West in the days of psychology, and you'll note that as I talk about the experiment. He did very little ethical consideration that goes into it by today's standards. In fact, lots of people would love to replicate the study today, but it's very few universities, I think, will give me full approval to it because it relies on deception. And I'll explain it to you. So the first thing Milgram did was he puts out a notice offering to compensate people. I'll pay you $4 for 1 hour of your time. Apparently it was a significant amount of money at the time. And he advertised it saying, persons needed for a study of memory. The ad itself is a lie, okay? He's not interested in people's memory at all, but this is the way he finds subjects for his study. So right from the outset, anyone who saw this ad and responded and came along were there under false pretenses, okay? Now when these people would arrive, Milgram will be there, he'll be wearing a white coat, he'd say, I'm the experimenter, I'm here to conduct this experiment. And people would come in, and he would have two people come in at the same time. And one of these people would be the person he was actually interested in, who didn't know what was going on at all. The second person who came in was actually part of Milgram's team, but also turned up saying, yes, I'm here for the study, what do we have to do? Okay? And Milgram says, well, we're doing a study on memory, and we're seeing if a small amount of punishment will help people to remember things better. Again, this is all a lie. This is what he says. He says, to do this, one of you is going to become a teacher and is going to teach the other person they just have these word pairing exercises to test memory. One of you will be the teacher and one of you will be the student. And the teacher, your job is to teach the pairs and then test them, and when the person who's the student makes a mistake, you have to give them an electric shock. And so the people go, oh, okay, and then goes, Milgram goes, well, we'll flip a coin to work out who's what, and he flips the coin, and sure enough, the person who's in on the experiment every time becomes the student, every time. And that's this gentleman here, okay, the one who's been strapped down. So he's in every single time a person comes up to there, he always becomes the student, and the other person who he's interested in, who knows nothing about the study, is always the teacher. And the first thing, he at this stage, he then goes, well, you know, you're the teacher, you're not going to be getting any of these electric shocks. It's only fair that you get one so you can feel what it's like for the other person getting the electric shocks. And so they put the electrodes on the person, they give them a zap, and they go, oh yes, okay, that was a bit sore. And that's the only electric shock that actually happens. Is the teacher, the person who's the subject of the study, they're the only one to actually get an electric shock at all. They then take the person who's the student into another room and they hook them up. At this stage the person says, oh, this isn't going to be too bad. I do have a bit of a heart condition. Right? So they're ramping it up. And they say, no, you'll be perfectly fine. This is perfectly safe. And then they shut them in the room and they come out, and the student and the experimenter sit together in another room, and they have a control panel, and they have some other devices for talking to each other between these two rooms. But basically this person is locked in a room, and all they can do is occasionally hear them through the wall, but actually this person's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And this is what the shock generator looked like. And the rule of the experiment was every time they make a mistake, down at this end you had to start with the lowest volt and you zap it, and then you just had to keep moving up. Every time there's a mistake, you have to give them a slightly stronger shock. Now, of course, remember, none of the shocks are real. And this is what the scale is. So you can see down at a slight shock, and then comes moderate, strong. By the time we get up this end, danger, extreme shock, and at this end it just says XXX. So this is how this machine is labelled. Okay. And that's what they had to do. So, of course, intentionally, every once in a while, the person who's locked in this other room makes a mistake and they have to get shocks. And basically the experiment was to see how far this person giving the shocks would go. All right? Will they go all the way up to the end? Will they only go halfway? Will they only do 2 or 3? And the person in the other room also has a bit of a script. And the script says, you know, when you get up to whatever it is, you know, 180 volts, you're going to yell. Okay? So they zap and suddenly there's a ow. Okay? And then it might go a bit higher and they might yell out, actually I've had enough, I want to get out. And again, if it gets up to this point, if it gets all the way up to this point, eventually they're going to be really yelling and screaming. And if the experiment carried on beyond that, then this person in the other room would eventually just go silent. All right? So that was sort of the plan of attack, and then they went about it. And the other thing is that if the person, you know, giving the zaps at any point said, oh, it sounds like they're really hurting, I need to stop. The scientist, the person conducting the experiment, would just say, but I need you to finish the exercise, or but the experiment, you know, it's not going to work if you don't finish it, or I need you to continue. Just very slight prompts like that, and that was it. So this is how we end up. We end up with this room with the learner in another room hooked up to this electrode. We've got the person there and the experimenter sitting there keeping an eye on them, you know, just gently nudging them every once in a while to do it. So this is what he set up. What do you think happened? So Milgram predicted that only 10% of subjects would shock higher than 180 volts. So this was his prediction going into it. So that's this level on the shock generator. So there you go. Cool. Said only 10%. And in fact, he theorised that really anyone who goes higher than that, he said, they'll be a psychopath. They won't have empathy. It'll be that very small percentage of the population who just don't get what it's like to imagine being another person in pain. All right? And so he theorised quite a lot about what it would take to get people all the way up. And essentially he thought it was going to be quite hard to persuade people to go further than that. Disturbingly, he found that 70% of people shocked to this level. And that 70%, even after they ran out of, well, they were still making mistakes. They'd just keep zapping them at the highest level. And then after that stage, he'd say, once the person went silent, and they said, well, the person's not even answering, what do I do now? And I'd say, treat a failure to response as an incorrect answer. Just keep zapping them. People keep zapping them. So, as far as they're aware, there's a dead body in the other room, people keep zapping them. 70%. Now, this finding is known as obedience to authority, because that's what he was measuring. It went back to the Eichmann experience. I was just following orders. And essentially, that's what he was looking at. He was saying, even if I just have a mild authority figure and I'm asking them, can I, basically, we can take just about anyone off the street and turn them into a murderer, just by prompting them, saying, but I need you to finish this. It's a terrifying thing to discover, really. This study has been replicated many times. As I say, at this point in time, it's very hard for people to replicate it, but it was replicated in Germany, and they found over 90% of people shocked to the highest level. Okay, so there's a cultural aspect to this finding, but as I say, across the world, it's a consistent one. But actually, this idea of authority, and with very minimal thing, people will go. A high percentage of people will go all the way to the end. So, how does this relate to religion? Well, straight off the bat, I can think of a couple of authority figures. There are authority figures in my life. Okay, so it's a bit light-hearted, but actually there's a serious point. Okay, often those who end up with positions in authority in the church fail to realise how much power we really have, and that comes through in lots of ways. So there you go. There's me hanging out with some of my clergy cronies. Now, clergy collars have lost something of their sway, but that said, there are still many, many people who find the clergy collar to be a very powerful symbol. Very powerful. So two quick stories in that regard. The first was the day after my ordination 14 years ago. Now, at that time, I was working at Wellington City Mission. So within 24 hours of being ordained, I found myself walking through the streets of Newtown and Wellington wearing my dog collar, and that was when it happened for the first time. Good morning, Father. Good morning, Father. Keep going down the street. Good morning, Father Richard. Yeah, it was quite a head trip. I was 28 years old, and suddenly all these people who wouldn't have interacted. In fact, dare I say, I was rougher looking then than I am now, and people wouldn't say hello to me on the street typically. In fact, they may even have moved to avoid me. But suddenly, with the collar on, hello, you're someone worth talking to. Yeah, so it changed, and it was very surprising to discover that. Just another short story. I was quite humbled some years later when I became involved with a conflict happening between a couple of people. And I happened to talk to one of them. I had an opportunity to take them aside and say, look, essentially I said, look, cool your jets. Okay, we can find a way through this, but you need to settle down a little bit. Yeah, you're saying this, that, and the other thing, let's just take some time with this and work on it together. So I made a couple of fairly minor suggestions about how to handle the situation. Now, some weeks later, that person, who was older than me, who was someone that I actually looked up to and respected, came and thanked me for that advice, and in doing so said, other people had said some similar things to me, but when you said it, I realised I had to listen. And they said that because I'm a clergy person. When I said it, they decided it was time to listen. So it turns out, because I'm ordained, I had much greater authority than I realised. Because as I say, when you've been doing this for a while, you take it for granted. But actually there are a lot of doors that open up because I'm a priest. A lot of doors. Jumping along. Next major study. I've got two more, just a couple more of these, and then we'll wrap it up for a night. So some of you may know of this one because there was a film last year, wasn't there? I think, that drew on this. Anyway, called The Experiment. It was at Rialto. There you go. I know some of you are Rialto goers. So this is known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. So in the 70s, a man named Philip Zimbardo, that's him up in the top right-hand corner, and he was a psychologist. He was on staff at Stanford University. And there was one day where he happened to be in a building and someone made a comment to him that that particular building was actually once a prison and had served as a prison. And he probed a little more and he discovered that actually in the basement, even though the rest of the building had been renovated and repurposed as part of the university campus, in the basement there were still prison cells that had never been converted to any refurbished for any other sort of purpose. And so Zimbardo was like, ooh, I feel an experiment coming on, right? So he decided to use these prison cells. And what he did was that they recruited a number of students from the Stanford campus for a 2-week study. Now on the first day he randomly assigned the students to 2 different groups. One of the groups was going to be the prisoners and the others would be the prison guards. Now the first that the prisoners knew about this and what group they were in was that a bunch of prison guards turned up in there wherever they lived and arrested them, and cuffed them, put them into a car and drove them off to the Stanford prison cells and put them kind of like through a booking. They fingerprinted them and washed them down, de-loused them, because of course that was a standard part of prison entrance at that time. So it was based very much on what exactly would happen in being inducted to a prison at the time. So that's the first thing that happens. Now the guards were organised into shifts and then told simply to do whatever they needed to do to make sure that the prison ran smoothly for the next 2 weeks. What followed was really a quick descent into hell. The guards used various forms of rewards and punishments, including the use of force and low-level violence. They asserted their dominance over the prisoners and very quickly lost sight of the fact that they were actually students in a study. And of course, that also involved various psychologically abusive methods to keep people under control. Similarly, the prisoners also forgot that they were in an experiment. Many became submissive and depressed and lost track of the time. They had no idea how long they had been there. They became like people doing hard time, really, and it happened very, very rapidly. After 6 days, Zimbardo became increasingly concerned about the well-being of those in the study and decided to enter the prison himself. Even though as the experimenter that was a somewhat questionable decision, because of course you should really be one step removed from your experiment. But upon entering the prison, the guards greeted Zimbardo as if he was the prison warden, and then took him on a tour of the prison, explaining all of the different things that they had, all the procedures and ideas they had developed and what a great job they were doing. And lo and behold, Zimbardo found that suddenly he just got caught up in the moment and became the warden of the prison. Started telling the guards what a great job they were doing. Forgot about why he had even gone into the prison at all, which was really to check on the prisoners. So following this experience, having got out of the prison, Zimbardo decided to put an end to the study at day 6, rather than to continue all the way to day 14 as planned. Now this study has been written about a great deal, and as I mentioned, there have been a number of documentaries as well as fictional accounts of this story. Now in reflecting on this experience, Zimbardo himself concluded that some contexts or situations are so powerful that they can shape or dictate human behaviour. The prison setting was so evocative that within a matter of hours people descended into all sorts of behaviour they did not believe themselves capable of. And Zimbardo himself experienced that when he entered the prison with one set of intentions, but quickly getting drawn in to this false reality he had created. A pretty amazing study, and again, one probably not to be repeated. How does this relate? to religion? And my answer really is that prisons, of course, are not the only environments that have the power to shape behaviour. Now, of course, the prison environment is a very powerful, it's a very powerful environment, but actually religious spaces are also spaces that shape human behaviour. Here you go, our place. I think as a society, as a whole, we're actually losing an appreciation for the idea of sacred spaces, at least when it comes to spaces like this one. Lots of people like to connect with God and nature in various ways. What I am speaking about here is not the way we might marvel at creation, and I think that's important, certainly part of most of our spirituality, but how over time humanity has often felt the need to create spaces intended purely to connect with the divine. That's what a sacred space, what a church space, even any sort of sacred building, mosques, temples, they're spaces designated for that purpose and typically that purpose alone. We use the space in a variety of ways, and most churches do these days. We try to make them fairly flexible buildings, but actually the primary purpose is always about this reaching out to the other. The way a church is constructed and furnished does condition how we use the space and how we experience the space, which in turn actually affects our religious experience also. I know other Christians who, while they appreciate the beauty of this particular space, also find it off-putting. And I have experienced that, particularly around various funerals I've taken for people of other denominations. They come in here, they marvel at the beauty, but it's also a little bit uncomfortable. Our worship space, and I think what it is that it suggests a level of formality which doesn't connect with everyone. Now this kind of worship space, and it is a worship space, suggests something very different about how one engages with worship. And there's lots I could say about that, but I'm not going to. You can make your own connections on this one. And look, just to be upfront, I'm not making any sort of judgment here. I know what works for me and other people know what works for them. For me, it's more this sort of space and less that sort of space, but I've enjoyed those sorts of spaces too. It's just part of the great variety of religious expression out there. But what I'm drawing your attention to is the fact that this space, St Andrews, does shape your religious experience. It has certainly shaped much of my practice as a priest, because, let's be honest, it's not a terribly flexible space. There are only so many ways we can use this space. And that's partly why most modern churches these days do not have large fixed pews. They have a variety of seating so that they can use different configurations. The idea behind that primarily, it's not to do with poo-pooing our particular style, but rather to say, if we have flexibility, there are different ways we can use our sacred space and therefore different experiences to be had. So it's kind of sometimes flexibility just means there's more opportunity for different experiences. A slightly different take on the Zimbardo prison study, and this idea of environments shaping behaviour concerns the holy city itself, Jerusalem. So has anyone here heard of Jerusalem syndrome? You haven't heard of Jerusalem? Oh, this is exciting. I get to tell you about it. Okay, so in a nutshell, Jerusalem syndrome is a form of psychosis triggered by a visit to Jerusalem. It is not specific to one single religion, but it has affected Jews, Christians and Muslims of many different backgrounds. The best known, although not the most prevalent manifestation of Jerusalem syndrome, is where a person who has seemed, well-balanced, healthy, not had any psychotic experiences, suddenly does become psychotic upon visiting Jerusalem. And for example, quite a common psychosis that occurs is people believing either, they're Jesus, or the Messiah, or an angel, or Mary Magdalene. These are quite common expressions, and in fact, hundreds of people every year where this happens. So there are lots of theories about why it happens, but part of the reason is that Jerusalem, just like a prison, is loaded with meaning, particularly religious meaning. There is so much history, theology, tradition, and debate about this place, but more than that, there is also lots of competing histories, theologies, and traditions. So it's no wonder when you get this great crossroads of the great Western religious traditions that it's overwhelming, and some people get caught up in that space. I'm pleased to say I didn't succumb to Jerusalem syndrome when I was there 2 years ago, but I definitely have a sense of why it might happen, because when you've been there, it is quite overwhelming, and there is all of this stuff that doesn't necessarily line up the way you thought it was going to when you were there, when you arrived there. For me, that experience was mostly one of the things, actually, for the most part, it works quite well, better than I thought it would. And there's quite a lot of coexistence, although, of course, that coexistence is very fragile, but it is there. Anyway, the key point here is environments shape behaviour, and that includes religious environments. One final thought, and then we're done. And I've talked about this before. I included it because a particular parishioner keeps coming back and talking to me about this and plugging me some more about it because he enjoyed it so much. So this is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So initially it concerns something that actually psychologists need to avoid, but of course it has an application around religion as well. Now the way this idea works is that the person with the gun shoots randomly at a board. Randomly. They just fire a bunch of shots off. They then, when they're finished, they go over to the board and find a place where lots of these random bullet holes are clustered quite closely together, and at that stage they take out the paint can and they paint on their bullseye. Okay? So they draw the target over those holes, which gives the appearance of being a sharpshooter. Look how well I did when I hit all those things in the target. Okay? Now in psychology, this idea is applied to the situation where people look at a set of data and then apply meaning to some of it and ignore other bits of it. Okay, so it's reading a result onto what they really wanted to find rather than actually saying, well, look, it was random. Okay, because sometimes the answer is things are just random. All right? But where I see this playing out in religious circles is actually with how we deal with religious texts. So now I think this probably applies to a number of religious traditions, but I am going to speak specifically about my tradition here. The Bible is a complicated text. It has many authors, most of which are actually anonymous, well, anonymous in the sense that they are unknown to us. It spans many genres. It was written by people of different cultures in different parts of the world, with different thoughts and agendas, and of course living in different times. It has been tampered with verses being cut out or rewritten or cobbled together from a number of bits and pieces of someone else's writing. All right? It's a complicated book. It is the foundational text for Christianity. I believe that, and I would also agree with the claim that it is divinely inspired, meaning that it represents the writings of many people who are trying to respond in some way to an experience of God. Okay, so divinely inspired, it's a response to this experience of the holy other. I do not think that as Christians we have to sign up to every word and every verse in order to call ourselves Christians. Quite simply, that is impossible. It's impossible because there are contradictions in the text itself. Unsurprising, given all the places it's come from and all the different writers, but there are contradictions in the Bible. Rather, I think we need to wrestle with the text as a whole, seek to understand what it meant, when and where it was written, before seeking to discern what it might mean for us now. Where I get concerned about biblical interpretation is that some approaches to the Bible are like the Texas sharpshooter, We can pluck verses from all over the Bible, put them together, and then suggest that the pattern is obvious. But typically it isn't. One verse from Romans, another from Proverbs, and yet another from 2 Kings may look like they have an idea in common, but in reality they are different styles, written in different languages, have different philosophy and ideas, you name it. I have heard impassioned sermons that use this approach, and on the face of it, the case made on certain issues can seem to be very clear. But when we step back and seriously consider the great diversity of the Bible and what lies within, we begin to appreciate that a skilled preacher can create the impression of being a sharp shooter when in fact they are not. That said, I've pretty much spent this evening throwing a bunch of random ideas together in the hope of making some sense, and at this point I'm going to call it a night. So thank you for coming.